This abstract orb represents a shifting theological model. Notice how it aggressively reacts and changes shape based on the external nodes pulsing around it. This is a visual model of what modern theologians call theistic mutualism. It is the rising belief that God can undergo real relational changes or emotional shifts while still remaining God. Proponents of this view argue that God possesses distinct, separable attributes. They suggest he engages in a genuine, real-time give-and-take relationship with humanity, receiving new experiences from his creation. The motivation here is to make the divine feel more relatable to human experience. But mapping human emotional responses onto the Creator alters his basic ontological architecture. When you prioritize relatability by making God reactive, you erase the boundary between the infinite and the finite. You risk collapsing the creator-creature distinction entirely. For over 1,700 years, the common confession of the Church operated on a completely different premise, a baseline known as classical Christian theism. The classical tradition maintains that a composite changing God is a metaphysical impossibility. This contrasts the classical model of ontological immutability against theistic mutualism. We will logically test a composite mutable God to see if it holds up across three criteria. What happens if God has parts, if he changes, and if he fluctuates from day to day? We will see that introducing any composition or potentiality into God does not enhance his ability to relate to us. It destroys his absolute independence. The first test deals with mereology, the philosophical study of parts and how they relate to wholes. This 3D structural model represents the mutualist proposition. It depicts a composite God built from distinct blocks: power, love, knowledge, and justice. The absolute rule of mereology is that a part is, by definition, always less than the whole. If you isolate the power block, the whole is no longer complete. This creates an immediate problem of dependency. If God has parts, he relies on those parts to exist as he does. The parts become more fundamental than God himself. Furthermore, distinct components do not spontaneously assemble themselves. They require an external composer, something outside of God, to put him together and supply his unity. This is exactly why the medieval scholastic tradition rejected a composite deity. As Thomas Aquinas argued, every composite being is posterior to its components. A composite entity cannot be the first cause of the universe. If God were made of parts, both the parts themselves and the composer who assembled them would have to logically exist prior to God. Mutualists often argue that God can avoid these structural problems by simply choosing to undergo non-essential changes, that he sovereignly wills his own emotional or relational shifts. This timeline graph lets us analyze the mechanics of change. It tracks a hypothetical shift in divine perfection, plotting a movement from state A at time 1 to state B at time 2. Philosophically, any movement between these two states is the actualization of a potential. It is a transition from what could be to what is. If state B represents an improvement, perhaps God gaining a new relational experience, it means state A was deficient. God lacked a certain fullness of being that he later acquired. Conversely, if the change moves him to a lesser state of perfection, he ceases to be supreme. To avoid this logical trap, classical theists recognize God as actus purus, pure actuality. He possesses no unactualized potential. He is already everything that it is possible to be, fully and completely. Because an infinitely perfect being cannot possess unactualized potential, any claim of change in God inherently implies that he is either dependent on something new or deficient in his nature. Our third test examines the practical, daily outcome of a deity who experiences emotional or relational fluctuations based on human events. The premise of theistic mutualism is that God responds to human history in real time, entering into a genuine give-and-take relationship where human actions elicit new states of being within the divine mind. This diagram maps that proposed relational feedback loop. A human actor makes a choice, and the resulting arrow travels toward the mutable God node, causing its internal state to shift colors in response. If God's internal state is different on Tuesday than it was on Monday, he is receiving a new determination of being from an outside source. This creates an extreme ontological vulnerability. God's fullness is held hostage by the temporal history of the universe. He requires the actions of his creatures to experience his own existence completely. Historical Reformed theologians firmly rejected this vulnerability. Writers like Charles Hodge maintained that God's nature is absolutely impassible, meaning his divine essence cannot be subjected to external passions or fluctuations. A God who changes day to day becomes a passive recipient. By subjecting him to the timeline of the universe, the mutualist model destroys divine aseity, the doctrine of God's total self-sufficient independence. We have to ask the obvious question: if a simple, unchangeable God is the only logically coherent model, why does the Bible so often use language making God sound like a reacting, changing human? The error lies in reading God's metaphysical architecture directly off the surface grammar of human language. Our propositional statements are designed exclusively to describe a multi-part, composite universe. When we read sentences like, "God is loving and powerful," our finite cognition tricks us into seeing love and power as distinct, separable parts sitting side by side. This prism illustrates the classical solution. As a single white beam hits the glass, it fractures into a spectrum labeled love, justice, power, and wrath. The multiplicity we perceive is due to our fractured experience, not a fracture in God. Just as the entire color spectrum traces back to that single white light, God's varied actions in time trace back to one absolutely simple, unchanging essence. Tugging at the thread of divine simplicity inevitably unravels the entire creator-creature distinction. The God of classical theism is completely devoid of distinct parts, external composers, and unactualized potential. This demonstrates our theological security. The structure remains perfectly still while chaotic storms rage around it, illustrating an unchanging creator, entirely independent of the universe. This is the historic bedrock of Orthodox theology across traditions, visually cemented here in the Reformation wall, a consensus that God's simplicity and aseity are non-negotiable. True religion depends on a creator who does not need the universe to be fully himself. Because God is entirely independent and irreducible, he is uniquely worthy of absolute worship.